should those be banned, or are they helping? And there's all sorts of scenarios that we come up with saying, well, let's give all, and you can give performance-enhancing drugs in a more therapeutic way than they've been used in the past. So maybe we should have all the people on fire patrol on steroids, under doctor's supervision, because they need to go and they need to lift stuff. And then is that a benefit, or should that be illegal? Or maybe all these scientists and doctors should be on Ritalin or other CNS stimulants all the time, because then they'll discover more stuff? Or is that? These are a lot of interesting questions. Go ahead.
Okay. Yeah. Sorry. So my question is not so much what the issue is, but as somebody who's sort of intimately involved in the process, what your perception of sort of the sociology around that is. Like, is there a big movement towards criminalizing like this kind of drug use harder?
Yeah. No. The answer would be no. The focus would be on the widespread use of common recreational drugs and reducing harm to society.
Now, I know different countries have their own ways of thinking, and in terms of their governments, like for instance, some countries would legalize marijuana and others would. What factors would the legalizing contribute towards? Like, why would some governments say that, yeah, this is legal and others would? Where would you make something legal?
Well, I mean, it varies in politics from country to country, yeah. So I mean, that's the simple answer. So the United States is going to be the last, because they've invested billions and billions of dollars in their drug war, and so it won't be the last, but it'll probably be, happen later than other countries that maybe haven't had that mentality. And so, yeah, there's political variability. I mean, California's legalized medical marijuana, and the federal government's still rating those dispensaries. So it's going to be, I think that, I'm just guessing that they'll be relatively.
One thing about the public policy with respect to drugs, and the public policy in as far as programs that people are asking to be anonymous in, because they don't want to feel like they're any second-class citizens as opposed to people who don't have addiction problems.
Yeah, the question was basically about stigma, and that's what these a lot of these drug strategies are really talk about a lot, is removing or attempting to remove stigma from addicted individuals, and so that they can enter seek the help that they need or access social supports, and they feel comfortable doing so. So that's another big thing involved or around these drug strategies.
Letting people.
Yeah, and as well with overdose drugs. So, or with overdose situations, there's laws that basically say you're not going to get arrested if the police aren't going to investigate you if you bring your friend that is overdosed on something to the hospital. So trying to provide incentives for not going to the hospital out of fear of prosecution later. So that's what happened in Portugal, is that the overdose deaths dropped, because there was really presumably there was more willingness to take people for medical help, and they obviously needed it.
Less people in jail too, because when they decriminalize trafficking for marijuana, for instance, you wouldn't go to jail anymore for it to be legal for instance.
Yeah, the marijuana issue there's a lot of money involved in incarcerating individuals.
Oh yeah. Have you heard of research chemicals? I've read some stuff online where you have these chemicals which are sort of analogs to recreational drugs. Do you know if these are usually more or less lethal than?
Well, they could be either. Actually, there was an article in the Star. Dave Nichols was at Purdue just down the hall when I was there, and he's the sort of world expert in serotonin receptors and designing serotonin agonists and antagonists. And and the reason that he was in a news article is because someone had read his research paper and said they designed these 20 drugs for their researching serotonin, and then they went off and synthesized it, and there was an overdose death with a specific drug that he had made. And so he was, the article was about him in talking about how in the process of his research, other people took it and did something they weren't supposed to do with it, and how do you, should you stop researching these drugs, because as you research them, maybe you find something that ends up getting out there. So that's a good question. They could be more, it could be less dangerous.
As a researcher who's looking into stuff like harm reduction and recreational drugs, do you find there's any professional backlash because what you're looking at?
Well, I wouldn't say that I'm a harm reduction advocate. I teach about the mechanisms of drug action. I serve on the task force, and I try to ask the right questions. I mean, I am a harm reduction advocate to a certain extent. I'm not, standing in front of rallies and things. But I think when it comes to, I would say that there wouldn't be much professional backlash in my situation because I'm really what I really try to do is to talk very specifically about what the drugs are doing and talk about harm reduction, not saying this has to be done tomorrow, but saying, well, this initiative in this city reduced this by this much. And if it's effective, it's effective, and if it's not effective, it's not effective. I mean, if a harm reduction strategy triples the number of drug users in a community without doing any good, then it's not an effective, it's probably not an effective strategy. So I haven't found that yet.
I know marijuana has effects on people's campus and learning deficits and whatnot. It's either a stimulant or a hallucinogen, but has there been any research to its other effects lately, recently? Or is it just at a stance?
Yeah, well, I don't know about recently, but for a long time, marijuana's been used for millennia. But it's only been relatively recently that we even found the receptor that it activates. There's two of them. There's two cannabinoid receptors. I think I've got a picture of one. And these are G protein coupled receptors. And we found the receptors, and then it actually took us a long time to find what in our brains naturally was activating them. And there's a couple agonists for these receptors. But marijuana has all sorts of effects, both therapeutic and adverse. The research on learning and memory deficits are, there's two things about marijuana research. One is the learning and memory deficits, which are measurable but fairly variable. And the other thing, especially in the United States, is the idea of marijuana as a gateway drug. And there's been some studies that have shown that using marijuana increases the likelihood of using additional substances, and others that have questioned that study. And there's also the question of, if you think about why someone would use a mind-altering substance in the first place, did they use marijuana to become more likely to use other drugs, or were they already predisposed using other drugs? And marijuana, just because it's readily available relative to some other substances, was the first one they used.
I guess my next question, sorry, is it a stimulant or hallucinogen? Which category is it kind of?
It can be an hallucinogen, but generally it's not. It would be. It's actually kind of classified on its own. It's got some sedative properties. I guess you could describe sedative properties, but it doesn't really fit into the sedative category or the stimulant category.
What is it in our brains that activates these cannabinoid, whatever you call them?
Cannabinoid receptors. There's a drug, or there's a transmitter called anandamide, and then there's 2-arachidone oil glycerol and palmitoyl ethanol. And it's been a field of study as to what these, what's the physiological role of these receptors? Why do we have them at all?
Yeah, is there any insight into that?
Yeah, there's lots of various mechanisms, lots of different insights. You know, activating cannabinoid receptors does a lot of positive things in the brain. That's why it's used therapeutically a lot for nausea and vomiting, reducing pressure in the eye, stimulating appetite. It's got some analgesic effects. It's got beneficial effects on any conditions where there's spasticity or neuromuscular disorders. So it's probably involved in a lot of different systems.
For people who are addicted, sorry, go ahead.
I was just wondering, you haven't mentioned about association with schizophrenia and people that have a family history of schizophrenia. And if there's something that is going on with those persons who have a history of schizophrenia.
With respect to marijuana?
With respect to marijuana.
Well, a lot of drug use in schizophrenics is thought to be a form of self-medication. I don't know if I can speak specifically to your question, but there.
Okay. It's just that what I'm understanding is that people that have a family history of schizophrenia can have an onset of the disease that seems to be triggered by.
Yeah, it is reported to be a trigger for psychosis,
Yes.
as well as lots of other
So I was just wondering what was happening in the brain.
I don't know if it's well understood.
Isn't it also that it's not so much a trigger as maybe they're using it to try to deal with the problems of
Certainly
schizophrenia?
for nicotine, that's the case. I'm not sure with marijuana, but I have to check.
With the drug policy task force, I'm just kind of interested to hear how much of the talk about harm reduction, like, are people interested at all in like the effects of various policies on like the disruptive presence of organized crime?
Yeah, organized crime has been discussed.
What's the kind of stance opinion like? Does like unrelated violence go up due to something or?
Yeah, I don't know specifically to organized crime. I'm not familiar enough with the issue in the region to probably speak to it.
So I have a very broad question. You mentioned in the talk, I think it's kind of general knowledge, that drug policy has always been kind of disconnected with the scientific perspective on drugs. Is it your impression as somebody who I guess is fairly knowledgeable about the area that that's starting to change, or do you think it's still true today that our drug policies and drug laws are wildly disconnected from what is believed by the scientific community about their harm and benefits?
Well, I think it's better. I think it's always getting better. I don't know, and the idea of always having evidence-based actions, or evidence-based interventions in policy is always that idea is always gaining more and more traction. But certainly, there's still very broad stereotypes about drugs. There's always an artificial line drawn between illegal drugs and prescription drugs. There's always in people's minds usually drugs grouped together that maybe ought not to be grouped together. I've had to answer or to point out in the task force or in other situations, some fairly basic things about, well, actually this has this property. We had a whole conversation about salvia concern and justified that we had that conversation, but I needed to describe what it was and what it was doing and all sorts of things like that. So there's always room for education, I think, on policy as well, and that's true for the prescription drugs. When I was working with HPRAC, there were a lot of misconceptions about the use and misuse of prescribing prescription drugs as well.
So one more question for you. It's about the body of the human body that will take into